in my Crohn's disease patients. It's an ulcerating condition of the intestine. I looked at 60 patients. 3 of them had significant skin problems with rosacea. And when they were active with their inflammatory bowel disease, their skin was active. So it really is a telltale sign. And these were just classic rosacea patients.
Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Before we dive into today's episode, I want to thank my sponsor, Cuss Cuss Skincare. Cuss Cuss products were created to assist in reducing inflammation through the wisdom naturally found in botanical ingredients. All formulas are non-GMO, 99% organic, 100% plant-based, and crafted with love to help nourish and rejuvenate your skin. One of my favorite products, their Sen Face Serum, includes CBD. I found it helps reduce redness and is so incredibly light that it's the only face serum that I'll apply in the morning to rehydrate my skin. Now, if you don't know what products are best for your skin, they offer sample packs for both their face serums and body waxes, both of which, by the way, I have purchased. There are so many different products that I love, and I know you will too. To support your journey to healthier skin, Cuss Cuss is offering Healthy Skin Show listeners 20% off your first order. All you have to do is visit them at cusscuss.com. That's KHUS-KHUS.com and join their email list to get access to the discount. Welcome back to episode number 19 of the Healthy Skin Show. Today, we are going to continue diving into the realm of SIBO and how it can be connected to certain skin conditions, specifically rosacea. But first, I want to take a question from one of our listeners, Linda.
Hi, I have food sensitivities, and sometimes I have skin reactions, and I'll scratch it and it will break out. What is the best supplement or topical ointment that I can use to help heal the sore that is created due to bacteria in my fingernails that's causing the sore to prolong the healing? Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much for taking the time to submit this question for us to answer. You are likely not the only person to have this experience where eating some type of food can cause your skin to become super itchy. You scratch and then it becomes more or less like a sore or a wound. Now, before I answer this question, I do need to clarify and remind you that I am not a doctor nor a medical practitioner, so I cannot give you advice on what to apply to that wound that'll help it heal. And in fact, if you are developing wounds or sores in general, I think your best bet is to go see your doctor, get the area swabbed to make sure that it is not a staph infection, because a staph infection is not something you want to mess with. And frankly, if I were you, I wouldn't be putting all sorts of natural products on my skin with the hopes that it's just going to heal up, especially if you're saying that this is a sore that will not seem to go away. So my recommendation would be, in this particular case, utilize your doctor, find out what exactly is causing the issue, and approach it from that perspective. Now, here's a couple of other points that you can and should consider. If you still have food sensitivities that are causing issues like this, that means that there's still probably some work that needs to be done in your gut. And I don't want to go into this at length because you guys have heard me over many episodes discuss the connection between your gut and your skin. It's not to say that when you do a lot of work on your gut that you're going to completely and entirely resolve your food sensitivities. But if you've got a lot of food sensitivities lingering, that's a problem. And it means that we still have to look deeper into what's underlying them. That way, we can ultimately alleviate the issues, lessen the body's reactivity, and hopefully not have issues like this where you'll experience some sort of flare that's causing this itchiness. Number 2, it would be good to know, if you haven't already had any testing done yet, if there aren't any environmental allergies or food allergies that may also be causing this reaction and causing you to feel really itchy. And last but not least, and I think this is something that people discount because we think, well, it's a mineral. How important can it be? But zinc is very important for skin healing. In fact, it's so important that it's a required mineral. There's actually these little things called zinc fingers that help your DNA replicate. So when we build new cells, we have to make copies of the DNA in other cells. And that's how our body creates brand new cells. Well, you have to have zinc in order for that process to happen. If you're noticing that skin healing in general seems to be slow, what you want to look for then is your red blood cell or erythrocyte zinc level. And for more information on testing that I recommend and utilize in my clinical practice, I'll put a link in today's show notes that will take you directly to the article that we have on Skinterrupt that defines and describes these particular tests, which you can actually go to your doctor and ask them to run. There are labs that can be run through conventional labs. And so zinc is just super important. It's why you may see some bandages and even some clothing that's coming out now for those of us with chronic skin issues that is laced with zinc to help and aid in the healing process. So something to consider, especially too if you're noticing that your skin is having trouble healing. But again, you can't just use zinc. Zinc alone is not going to solve your problems if you've got an infection present that needs to be addressed appropriately. And in order to really address it appropriately, I always get nervous when someone has chronic skin issues and they're developing sores or wounds that are having trouble closing. My 2 cents is just like, hey, let's go to the doctors. Let's make sure this does not have staph or something else that's more serious. And then you have some direction as well as peace of mind as far as where you need to go next and what you need to do next. But it is important in these instances to utilize your doctor. I don't think just cutting out your doctor entirely is the smartest move. And I also know that sometimes it can be frustrating because you feel like your doctor, your dermatologist has failed you once or many times. And so it's easier to just say, the heck with you. But the reality of it is that they have access to things that you may not. They also have knowledge about things that you may not. So in some instances, having them as part of your team can be helpful. And so that's why I always recommend that you either find a dermatologist or a doctor that's willing to work with you, and that you're open to feedback about when you need to go get medical care, when you need to go get things checked in order to be safe. You certainly don't want a sore or a wound to fester, trying all of these natural things when in reality, you just needed an antibiotic in that moment. And while I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of antibiotics and steroid creams and all that jazz, we do need those things. There is a time and a place for them. And we need to be open to the idea of blending these two worlds together to find the most effective and efficient way forward for you that's also safe. And for anybody listening who's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that Jen answers questions, or I'll even take these questions to my guests, go over to healthyskinshow.com, scroll down and leave us a voicemail so that we can include your question in an upcoming episode. We love taking questions. This is a community. Let's get you answers. All right. Let's dive into the conversation now between my colleague, Dr. Leonard Weinstock, who is considered to be a real expert in the world of SIBO, but he's also doing some amazing research and work in the world of skin problems. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I have a very special guest with me who I will admit I kind of stalked online and then finally got in touch with him. And he is here to talk to you today about the connection between rosacea and SIBO. And if you don't recall what SIBO is, you can go back and check out one of those previous podcasts. I'll put in the show notes that I did on SIBO. What is it and its connection to skin issues? But we're going to focus today specifically on rosacea. My guest today is Dr. Leonard Weinstock. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist, as well as being board certified in internal medicine. He is an associate professor of clinical medicine and surgery at Washington University School of Medicine and also has a private practice. Dr. Weinstock is an active lecturer and has published more than 85 articles, abstracts, editorials, and book chapters. He is researching the role of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and mast cell activation syndrome in a variety of syndromes. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jen. Thank you.
As I said, I kind of did a little bit of stalking. It wasn't my fault, though. I mean, you wrote a really fascinating article, and it wasn't even an article. It was actually a journal article. So I was perusing the science, and I came across this really interesting article called Rosacea and Small Intestinal Bacterial Overgrowth, Prevalence and Response to Rifaximin. And I was like, whoa, I need to find the person that co-authored this.
Funny.
I
All
know.
right.
So it's really great because a lot of people are struggling with rosacea. They don't understand why they have it, and they become incredibly frustrated and even self-conscious because it's hard to wear makeup. It's hard to cover that up. And ultimately, it's my belief that there's something underlying a lot of these things. It's not just necessarily your skin that is the problem. And at least that has been my experience with my own personal skin issues, as well as working with clients. So how did you end up making this connection initially between rosacea and SIBO?
Well, in particular, I read a journal article that the Italians came out with in 2008, and they made the connection. But I've been looking for connections of bacterial overgrowth and many extraintestinal manifestations, including restless leg syndrome and chronic pain disorders and pelvic pain disorders. So I looked for everything related to bacterial overgrowth because I thought that disruption of your microbiome would have a great deal to do with inflammation. And not only could it account for symptoms outside my regular old Crohn's patients, but patients with irritable bowel with bacterial overgrowth. So I saw this great article and I thought it was fantastic. I showed it to friends of mine and patients of mine who were physicians and dermatologists. And even though it was an excellent randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study, they just said, well, needs more work. And so I decided I was going to do the work and try to reproduce it in my own patients. And also look at rosacea in some inflammatory patients of my own, namely those with Crohn's disease.
Interesting. So you've been looking at rosacea for quite a while now, because this article I found is from 2013.
Right. Well, it takes a little while to get going, and we had a preliminary presentation in 2011. So it started fairly rapidly, but it requires time getting approval from the investigational review board to do the studies and so forth.
So why do you think it is that there's even a connection between SIBO, so bacteria where it should not be? It's in the small intestine, should be in the large intestine, but for any number of reasons, it has moved upwards in the wrong direction. What do you think is the connection? Like, is rosacea essentially, could that be considered almost like a symptom of the SIBO, or are they just sort of two separate conditions that can occur together?
Okay, great question. Well, it all comes down to what's happening in the lining of the intestine, what kind of cells are being attracted. So when there's bacterial overgrowth and you've got this load of bacteria, namely usually colonic bacteria in the small intestine, it's toxic. It creates inflammation. It breaks down the lining of the gut, increasing intestinal permeability, the so-called leaky gut. With that, you get excitation of inflammatory cells, mast cells, lymphocytes. So some of our patients will get hives because the mast cells get activated and release histamine. But there are many chemicals that are released, these cytokines, 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 and those things circulate in the bloodstream. So for my IBS patients, I was seeing patients with chronic fatigue, muscle pain, brain fog, and it wasn't just because their gut was abnormal, it was because there's circulating factors that cause symptoms outside of the gut. And so when I read that article by the Italians, and it was a combination of GI and dermatologists that got together, and they had done a number of studies on irritable bowel and bacterial overgrowth, I thought, wow, this is yet another example of inflammatory chemicals derived from the gut coming out into the body, going to the bloodstream, going to the skin, causing inflammation, vascular changes. So there's flushing that's going on. Well, there are chemicals that come out that are released by mast cells in the gut and that are vasoactive and that can cause flushing. And so that's a very common sign of somebody who's got mast cell activation syndrome, flushing. So that's a big part of rosacea. And then there's the inflammation with the papules and painful and tender skin. And those could certainly be things that are going on with inflammatory cells in the skin, and yet chemicals that go via the bloodstream to the skin.
So essentially what you're saying is that in conventional medicine, my dad's a doctor, so I understand he deals with eyes. And so typically they're like, everybody deals with their own region. But what you're essentially saying for everyone listening who's maybe new to this concept, that everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. You've got so much going on in the gut. Essentially, that's where the problem initiates, and then it floods out essentially and shows up elsewhere. It's specifically in this condition on your skin.
Absolutely. So much is going on. For instance, in my Crohn's disease patients, it's an ulcerating condition of the intestine. I looked at 60 patients. 3 of them had significant skin problems with rosacea. And when they were active with their inflammatory bowel disease, their skin was active. When I could get their skin better with one technique or another, whether it be antibiotic or anti-inflammatory drugs, their skin got better. So it really is a telltale sign. And these were just classic rosacea patients.
And one thing that was really interesting to me, and yes, I know the article that I was looking at is from 2013. So perhaps with now more experience clinically, you've seen these numbers fluctuate. But at least what I thought was interesting was that you had observed a relationship where 46% of the prospective patients with rosacea had SIBO. That's like almost 50% of people. And the sad thing is that when skin clients come to me saying, oh, I want to address my skin, they ignore or write off every other symptom that's happening someplace else in their system. So should this be a wake-up call to anyone listening to this who has rosacea, that they need to start tuning in to all the symptoms that they are experiencing throughout the body instead of just fixating on their skin?
Absolutely. Now, not everybody who's got a condition related to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, such as rosacea or restless leg syndrome, have GI symptoms. But in particular, do you have bloating, gas, distension, trapped gas, abdominal discomfort, altered bowel habits as a chronic problem? Some of my patients who get this have had an infection, like they went to Mexico or to a bad restaurant and had a diarrheal disease. And then that creates an inflammatory pathway going on in the gut, which then can be followed by symptoms outside of the gut. So it is important to consider both with and without GI symptoms. Could your GI tract be the trigger?
Interesting. So when a patient comes to you with rosacea, because it's interesting,
Right.
your specialty is gastroenterology, but you've actually created this very interesting bridge that we don't often see, but I would love to see more and more in conventional medicine, of bridging these gaps and connecting the systems, because it's so important. And people really, I think, tend to improve more quickly and get help. But so in this study, you used rifaximin, which is a pretty typical non-absorbing oral antibiotic that people use with SIBO sometimes, if they can get their hands on it. Do you feel like in the cases that you see now, with all the experience, obviously a number of years later, do you feel like that's still the right treatment to consider? Are there other things that people who are listening should consider or think about or talk to their doctor about?
Well, with respect to insurance companies who dictate what you can get and what you can't, it comes down to this. If you have irritable bowel syndrome with diarrhea and you've tried a couple of different classic treatments, which generally don't work well anyway, and you failed that, then you're a good candidate for Rifaximin. So as long as you have irritable bowel syndrome with diarrhea, your insurance company will approve it. That's a problem if you don't. Now, if you
if you're more constipated, then it's a problem.
Right. Now, in that setting, you also have to look at what we call lactulose breath test to see if you have hydrogen and methane, because if it's just hydrogen, usually it's bloating, gas, and diarrhea. If it's methane, it could be constipation or a mix of both, diarrhea and constipation. And I do want to say that herbal antibiotic therapy is an alternative for those people who can't get the Rifaximin, don't want to use other antibiotics, because actually Rifaximin is unique in the regard that it does not get absorbed by virtually any means. 0.4% gets absorbed. And so it stays in the gut, works in the gut, and it's directed towards the small bowel where it's bile solvent and doesn't get into the colon to create havoc and cause complications of antibiotics. So it's unique in that regard. But once again, insurance companies are only going to approve this antibiotic if you've got irritable bowel syndrome and failed treatment. So someday, hopefully, more studies will be done on rifaximin and rosacea. And for those, let's say, who have a positive test for bacterial overgrowth, their insurance will cover it because it's a 2-week course. In the study by the Italians, they did not have any relapses for 9 months.
Wow.
Whereas with irritable bowel, the average relapse is 3 to 4 months, where you'll need another course of the antibiotic.
That's really fascinating that was creating such a major impact that they no longer had. I mean, just such an extensive period of time that they were free of those symptoms and rosacea and maybe other GI issues. It's just so cool. And, I think this underscored, this is actually one of the cool things that I love about this particular podcast, is that we're looking at one issue, except we're finding another way into it,
Mm-hmm.
Finding another pathway or solution that is in a sense novel and different and outside of the box, but it's because you're connecting the dots between the two instead of just saying, oh, we have to look at the skin. That's all there is. We know that that's not true. And I know that you also use low-dose naltrexone as well, the LDN. Do you ever use that with any of your rosacea patients?
If they don't have SIBO, then I'll give them a try. And I've seen some benefit, but I haven't had enough patients to be able to say, okay, that's great. LDN, low-dose naltrexone, has been helping my patients with psoriasis and various autoimmune conditions that affect the skin. So I love it in that regard. Basically, it increases the endorphins, which reduce T and B cell function and reduces cytokines, the inflammatory chemicals. So it's been very good for my patients with inflammatory bowel disease or autoimmune conditions in general. I do also want to emphasize that gut health is important. Not only is it diet related, because again, if you've got this increased intestinal permeability, because of the bacterial overgrowth, you do want to attend towards healthy products that heal the gut lining. So I use a lot of zinc, L-glutamine, bovine immune globulin that I use as well. But healing the gut lining after you treat with antibiotics, I think also plays an important role.
I agree with that. I mean, I found beyond my scope of practice is like the whole antibiotic and medication space, which I can't get into. And I'll usually encourage clients to go back to their doctor or a physician like yourself to get help. But if we do work with botanicals, that always has to be a big piece of it, right? Because you can't just expect the gut to go back to normal. You have to do some work afterwards to help it find balance, to reseal, so to speak, in air quotes, and get the inflammation to come down and let your body just get used to that new balanced level. You know, there's this idea that we like to swing back to homeostasis. If you've been sick a long time, it wants to stay where it's been, unfortunately, in a state of imbalance. And so you've got to do some work to get it back to a healthier spot and really support it to stay there. So I just want to thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I would love to have you back to talk more about the low-dose naltrexone and how you've been working with psoriatic patients. I think that would be absolutely fascinating if you would be so kind to indulge us. And I also, too, want to invite every single person listening to this to go check out your website. You've got two separate sites. They're kind of one and the same, but there's two ways to get there. You can go to gidoctor.net or rosacearescue.com. And I promise everyone I will put those two links in the show notes. So if you're listening, don't worry about writing stuff down. Just come to this podcast and everything will be there for you so that you can easily find and get in touch with Dr. Weinstock. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Mind-blowing, right? So if you know somebody struggling with rosacea, and I think most of us ladies know maybe at least one person who is struggling with rosacea, it's both men and women, share this podcast with them because this may be a huge aha, especially because a lot of the information that's talked about online only links rosacea with candida. But there are clearly other gut triggers that can cause it. And so it's nice to have some more information to consider. As always, everything that we've discussed is over in this podcast show notes. So head on over there to check it out. And I can promise you that Dr. Weinstock is going to be back with another interview. So stay tuned. And of course, I'm wishing you a wonderful, beautiful rest of your day. And I'll see you in the next episode.